The grand ballroom of the Vance estate in Atherton, California, was alive with the symphonic hum of high society. 12-year-old Matthew Vance stood motionless near a white marble column, an invisible ghost in a crowded ocean. His father, Alexander Vance, the brilliant and formidable CEO of a Silicon Valley tech empire, dominated the center of the room. He never once turned his head toward the quiet corner where his only son stood. A young girl of 11, the daughter of one of the estate's domestic staff members, found the courage to break away from the shadows. Lucy Hayes walked slowly across the polished floor, raised her hands, and gracefully formed the word "hello" in sign language. For the first time that long night, Matthew's face was illuminated by genuine happiness. This is the story of a forgotten boy who lived in the quiet, a brave girl who chose to look where others turned away, and a proud father who had to lose his bearings before he could learn to listen. At 11 years old, Lucy Hayes stood in a secluded corner of the magnificent mansion, watching the shimmering reflections of mirrors and crystal chandeliers while feeling like a tiny, insignificant shadow amidst a sea of powerful adults. Her innocent mind grappled with a deep, confusing contradiction as she closely observed the master of this enormous Northern California estate. A man who seemed to possess an intimate, smiling familiarity with every wealthy stranger in attendance, yet completely ignored his own flesh and blood. The sprawling Vance residence glowed brilliantly against the dark California night sky. For Lucy, whose presence was only because her mother Chloe served as executive housekeeper, this world felt unreachable. She knew she did not belong. Her great-grandfather, Donald Hayes, had taught her sign language, learned for his deaf army friend Andrew after a mortar explosion. Never abandon a soul who is stranded in the dark, Lucy, he told her. That rule belongs to every human being. From behind the emerald drapes, Lucy watched the guests. She saw Matthew in a distant corner, tense and hyper-alert, following lips with heartbreaking concentration. She knew he had been deaf since the car accident that killed his mother. Guests offered superficial pity, or spoke at him slowly. No one actually spoke with him. Alexander accepted a humanitarian award on stage without glancing at his son. Lucy remembered Donald's words. She slid the poetry book into her pocket and stepped out across the marble floor. She stopped in front of Matthew and signed "hello" with trembling hands. Matthew's dark eyes instantly widened to an extraordinary degree, and the heavy, defensive mask of complete indifference completely vanished from his youthful face in a fraction of a second. For several long, breathless moments, the boy simply stared at her hands in absolute disbelief. Then, a magnificent, radiant smile broke across his face, a completely genuine expression of pure joy that altered his entire countenance. The profound aura of loneliness vanished from his eyes, and his own hands flew into the air, moving with a lightning-fast, practiced precision as he signed back to her, asking if she truly knew how to sign. Lucy offered a shy, incredibly nervous smile. She raised her hands once more, moving them with deliberate slowness to sign back the word, "a little." Despite her lack of fluency, Matthew understood her intention perfectly. She pointed to her own chest and began to spell her name. She carefully formed the individual letters, L-U-C-Y, while Matthew watched with immense patience, nodding encouragingly. Once she had finished, he smiled warmly, pointed a finger directly at his own chest, and rapidly signed his own name, M-A-T-T-H-E-W, before executing a unique, personalized sign for himself. It was by no means a flawless or sophisticated conversation. Rather, it was a beautiful, fragmented dialogue constructed out of a few basic words, improvised physical gestures, and spontaneous bursts of shared laughter. Lucy tentatively raised her hands to ask him if he was enjoying the massive, elegant party surrounding them. Matthew immediately wrinkled his nose in comical disgust, crossed his arms, and shook his head in a manner that required absolutely no translation, clearly communicating that he found the entire event incredibly boring. Lucy let out a soft, involuntary giggle, which caused Matthew's eyes to dance with delight as he pointed toward a group of nearby high society guests who were gesturing grandly with their wine glasses. The boy comically puffed out his chest, elevated his chin into the air, and began to mimic the arrogant, self-important nodding of the wealthy tech investors with hilarious accuracy. Lucy understood his silent parody instantly, realizing he was calling them stuck-up and pompous, and both children found themselves laughing silently together, sharing a secret humor that no one else in the room could possibly comprehend. For the very first time during that long, exhausting gala, Matthew ceased to be the tragic, forgotten child melting into the shadow of a marble column. He was intelligent, he was sharp-witted, and he was profoundly alive. There, in the very heart of the sophisticated noise and corporate pageantry of the billionaire's charity gala, Lucy and Matthew had successfully manifested a tiny, sacred island of absolute silence. Yet, this was not a cold, hollow silence born of isolation. It was a vibrant, magical silence, overflowing with profound human connection, mutual understanding, and genuine companionship. On the opposite side of the crowded ballroom, Alexander Vance continued to graciously accept the endless congratulations of his wealthy peers. He remained utterly oblivious to the beautiful reality that his own son, standing only a few yards away, was experiencing true happiness for the first time in years. In the long, quiet weeks that followed the grand charity gala, the massive Atherton mansion gradually settled back into its rigid, predictable daily routine, but for Lucy, nothing would ever be the same again. The sprawling estate, which had previously felt like a cold, intimidating fortress of unapproachable wealth, now held a wonderful, precious secret that made her daily life vibrant with purpose. She had a true friend inside those walls. Their beautiful friendship began to flourish in stolen moments and quiet corners of the estate, completely shielded from the watchful eyes of Alexander Vance and the rest of the professional domestic staff. On quiet afternoons, they would secretly meet within the cavernous depths of the mansion's private library, where Matthew would eagerly pull down massive volumes filled with celestial maps. He would trace his fingers along the radiant nebulas, distant planets, and complex orbital charts, while Lucy sat beside him, focusing entirely on expanding her limited vocabulary of sign language. Matthew possessed an extraordinary degree of patience as a teacher, gently reaching out to adjust the positioning of her fingers with a soft touch, his face breaking into a warm smile whenever she successfully executed a difficult gesture. Beneath his quiet exterior, Lucy discovered that Matthew possessed a remarkably sharp, dry, and quick-witted sense of humor that he almost never revealed to the hearing world. One rainy afternoon, while they were perusing an expensive historical text detailing the history of the ancient Roman Empire, Matthew suddenly pointed his finger at a photograph of a marble bust depicting a particularly stern emperor. He frowned comically, narrowed his eyes into a cold glare, and pointed a finger directly toward the distant hallway where his father's private executive home office was located. Lucy understood the silent joke instantly, realizing he was implying that the ruthless Roman dictator looked exactly like Alexander Vance before he had consumed his first cup of black coffee in the morning. She had to quickly press both of her hands over her mouth to suffocate her laughter, while Matthew's eyes crinkled with silent, joyful amusement. However, of all their secret meeting places throughout the vast estate, their absolute favorite sanctuary was the sprawling, overgrown garden located at the very back of the property. This was an immense, beautiful landscape filled with manicured rose bushes, hidden stone benches, and a massive, ancient weeping willow tree whose sweeping green branches cascaded all the way to the grass, creating a natural tent. Beneath the protective green canopy of that ancient willow tree, the overwhelming pressure of the wealthy world outside seemed to completely evaporate, allowing both children to speak with total vulnerability. It was within this green sanctuary that Matthew finally found the courage to open up to Lucy about the painful memory of his mother, using his hands to paint a picture of a vibrant woman. She loved this exact garden more than any other place in the world. Matthew signed one afternoon, his fingers gently caressing the soft petal of a pristine white rose that grew near the base of the tree. He went on to explain that she had been an extraordinarily talented classical pianist, and he closed his eyes tightly, pressing his palm flat against the weathered wooden bench beneath them. She used to sit with me at the grand piano, and she taught me how to feel the music through my body, showing me how the deep vibrations traveled through the wood. Then, the joyful expression on his face faded into a dark, heavy shadow as his hands began to move with a slower, halting rhythm that broke Lucy's heart. But when the accident happened and she died, all of that beautiful music instantly stopped forever. and the endless silence took over everything. He gently touched his own ear with a profound, lingering sadness. He began to describe the horrific car crash not as a cohesive narrative, but in fractured, terrifying sensory memories. Blinding headlights, a deafening metal impact, waking up in a sterile hospital room, and realizing the world had been permanently muted. He explained that his father had been present at his bedside, but Alexander appeared completely broken, hollowed out by the sudden loss of his wife. Matthew remembered crying out desperately for his mother in that hospital room, but he could not even hear the sound of his own weeping voice. He could only watch the agonizing, paralyzed look of despair in his father's eyes. "My father never speaks about her to anyone anymore," Matthew signed, his fingers trembling slightly. "Never. He completely removed every single photograph of her from the walls of this house, and he made the grand piano disappear from the living room within a week. It is as if he is trying to completely erase her existence from our lives. 'Cause the pain of remembering is too much for him to bear." Lucy felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow wash over her entire being. Matthew had not only lost his mother and his physical sense of hearing on that terrible night, he had also completely lost the emotional presence of his remaining parent. "My great-grandfather Donald always says that our memories are a beautiful, sacred way to keep the people we love close to our hearts," Lucy said in a soft whisper before trying her absolute best to translate the thought into signs. Matthew absorbed the profound sentiment with a slow, contemplative nod. "The memories of my mother make my father suffer too much," Matthew signed back. "That is why he hides them away from the world." From that poignant moment onward, Lucy began to view the formidable Alexander Vance through an entirely different lens, no longer seeing him merely as a powerful, terrifying billionaire tech titan. She began to perceive him as a deeply wounded, frightened man who was profoundly lost inside the echoing halls of his own massive mansion. He possessed billions of dollars, immense global prestige, and absolute authority. Yet he walked through his magnificent home like a lonely, isolated ghost trapped in his own grief. His daily interactions with Matthew were incredibly brief, deeply awkward, and almost always handled through a barrier of corporate assistants, private tutors, and medical professionals. Alexander meticulously took care of every single material need, but had absolutely no idea how to cross the silent bridge into his heart. He gave Matthew absolutely everything that money could buy, except for the one priceless thing that the young boy desperately craved from his father: true, authentic presence. Meanwhile, Chloe's maternal anxiety regarding this secret, cross-class friendship continued to grow with every passing day. One evening, while they were sitting inside their small, modest apartment, located in the detached staff quarters of the estate, she looked across the table at her daughter with a mixture of deep love and overwhelming fear. "Lucy, you are an incredibly good girl, and you possess a heart that is far too big for your own good, but you must understand the reality of our situation," Chloe said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We are employees of the Vance family, Lucy. We are only allowed to live on this beautiful property because Mr. Vance permits it, and we cannot afford to forget our place in this house." Lucy slowly lowered her gaze to her hands, feeling a deep, stubborn resistance rising within her young spirit. "I am just being his friend, Mom," Lucy replied in a quiet, steady voice that carried a maturity far beyond her 11 years. "Matthew doesn't have a single other person in this entire house who actually talks to him." Chloe opened her mouth to immediately respond, wanting to tell her daughter that the billionaire's family problems were not their responsibility to fix. But the words became entirely trapped in her throat because, deep down in her soul, she knew her daughter was speaking the absolute truth. She too had noticed the undeniable, beautiful transformation that had taken place within the young master of the house over the past several weeks. Yet, the paralyzing fear of economic ruin was an incredibly powerful force. Lucy, however, possessed an internal compass that was vastly more powerful than her mother's fear, a strength anchored entirely by the enduring words of Donald Hayes. Whenever she felt a wave of doubt creeping into her mind, she would quietly open the small wooden box beneath her bed, where she kept her great-grandfather's military medals, his faded black-and-white photograph, and his old letters. Within those yellowed pages, the old soldier wrote passionately about the concepts of true honor, human kindness, and the sacred obligation to protect those whom society had discarded. Donald had always insisted that doing the right thing in this life is almost never the easiest path to choose, and for Lucy, remaining a loyal friend to Matthew was the only right path available. The beautiful, hidden world that the two children had so carefully constructed beneath the weeping willow tree was suddenly and violently shattered on a crisp afternoon in late autumn. Lucy and Matthew were laughing and playing a game in the expansive backyard, running along the ancient, moss-covered stone wall that separated the manicured lawns of the estate from the dense California forest beyond. A brightly colored kite that they had been flying suddenly lost its momentum in a shifting wind, plunging downward and becoming hopelessly entangled among the high, stubborn branches of an old oak tree. Matthew, who possessed a remarkable degree of physical agility and fearlessness that few people ever gave him credit for, immediately scaled the stone wall to reach for the caught string. Lucy stood directly below him on the grass, her face contorted with worry as she frantically raised her hands to sign for him to be incredibly careful. Matthew looked down and flashed her a confident, mischievous smile, but in the very next instant, his foot slipped violently on a slick patch of damp green moss that had grown over the stones. He completely lost his balance and fell sideways off the wall, tumbling heavily onto the uneven ground below with a dull, sickening thud. It was by no means a catastrophic height, but he landed awkwardly with all of his weight pressed violently against his right foot, his face instantly turning a pale, ghostly shade of white as he hit the grass. Lucy sprinted to his side within a second, her heart leaping into her throat as she found him sitting on the ground, gripping his ankle tightly with both hands. He was desperately trying to remain brave and stoic, forcing himself not to cry out, but his dark eyes were wide with intense physical pain, and his ankle was already beginning to swell rapidly. "Does it hurt badly?" Lucy asked frantically with her hands, her fingers shaking so violently that the signs were nearly illegible. Matthew nodded his head rapidly, a tear finally escaping his eye as he gripped his leg harder, and an overwhelming wave of terror took complete control of Lucy's mind. She knew with absolute certainty that she needed to run and find immediate medical help, but at the exact same time, the thought of leaving him alone and helpless in the dirt was deeply agonizing. "Stay right here. I am going to get help immediately," she signed with frantic, forceful movements before turning on her heel and sprinting toward the main house, faster than she had ever run in her entire life. She flew across the endless green lawns, burst through the heavy rear glass doors of the mansion, without pausing to remove her dirty shoes, and ran directly into the grand entrance hall, her lungs burning desperately for oxygen. "Please, someone help me," she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing off the high ceilings and causing several maids to drop their dusters in shock. "It's Matthew. He fell off the stone wall in the garden, and he's severely hurt." The sudden, frantic shouting drew the attention of Alexander Vance, who happened to be walking across the upper gallery of the grand staircase, reviewing a stack of corporate documents. He froze in absolute shock upon hearing his son's name, his face instantly hardening into an expression of intense alarm mixed with profound irritation as he looked down at the disheveled girl. "What on earth is the meaning of this shouting?" Alexander demanded, his voice booming through the hall as he rapidly descended the grand staircase. "What happened to my son?" "It's Matthew, Mr. Vance," Lucy gasped out, desperately trying to catch her breath while pointing toward the rear gardens. "He fell from the stone wall by the forest. I think his ankle is broken or badly sprained. He can't stand up." The polished, clinical composure of the billionaire tech executive completely vanished in an instant. Without saying another word, Alexander pushed past her and sprinted out into the garden with a frantic desperation. Lucy followed closely behind his long strides. They found the young boy exactly where Lucy had left him, huddled at the base of the stone wall, desperately trying to swallow his tears and appear strong. Alexander dropped to his knees in the dirt beside his son, his expensive suit trousers immediately staining with mud, but his hands remained frozen in the air above Matthew's body, hovering helplessly as if he were completely paralyzed. He had absolutely no idea how to physically comfort his own child, and he began to speak in a loud, frantic voice that was entirely unnecessary given the boy's condition. "Matthew, look at me. Are you okay? Can you hear me? Can you stand up? Alexander shouted, his voice cracking with panic, as if elevating the volume of his vocal cords could somehow shatter the eternal wall of silence that existed between them. Matthew merely shook his head in pain, his eyes darting to his father's face as he raised his hands to try and explain exactly how he had slipped on the moss. However, Alexander was not even looking at his son's moving hands. His panicked eyes were focused entirely on the boy's ruined clothes, the swelling tissue of his ankle, and the logistics of the medical emergency. To Alexander, the situation was a technical crisis that required immediate, top-tier professional resolution, rather than an intimate emotional moment that required a father's comforting touch. Matthew tried one more time to communicate, his fingers forming the signs for the kite and the tree. But his father had already turned his back, loudly barking orders to the estate security guards who had just arrived on the scene. Lucy stood a few feet away, watching this heartbreaking interaction unfold, and she realized the devastating truth of the situation with a profound, terrifying clarity. The immense distance that separated this father and son was not caused by Matthew's inability to hear sounds. It was caused by Alexander's absolute refusal to look at his son's hands. Alexander was physically standing less than a foot away from his child, yet he was completely, utterly absent from the boy's reality. Finally, seeing that his father was completely oblivious to his efforts, Matthew slowly lowered his hands to his side, abandoning all attempts to speak, and his eyes desperately searched the area until they found Lucy. He raised his hand slightly, moving his fingers with an incredible gentleness to sign to her, asking if she was going to be in trouble for being out here with him. Even while enduring intense physical agony, the boy's primary concern was protecting his only friend from the wrath of the house management. Lucy could not contain the powerful surge of emotion that exploded within her chest. She felt an overwhelming sense of profound injustice that completely obliterated her fear of the billionaire. The enduring voice of her great-grandfather Donald echoed through her soul with the strength of a thunderclap, reminding her that a true human being never stands by and allows another soul to be abandoned. She took a fierce step forward, her small frame rigid with indignation, and addressed the tech mogul directly. "Mr. Vance," she cried out, her voice cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the security guards. Alexander turned his head sharply, his brow furrowed with intense stress and annoyance. "Not right now, girl," Alexander snapped coldly, waving his hand to dismiss her. "Can't you see my son is injured? Go back to the servant quarters immediately." But Lucy refused to take a single step backward. She stood her ground on the grass, pointing a finger directly at Matthew's lowered hands. "He is trying to talk to you right now, sir," Lucy shouted back, her voice ringing with a powerful authority that shocked everyone present. "He has been trying to speak to you this entire time, but you won't even look at him." An absolute freezing silence fell over the entire garden as the security guards froze, and Alexander Vance turned slowly to stare at the housekeeper's daughter. He looked down at his silent son, and for the very first time in his life, he actually forced himself to observe Matthew's hands. Hands that had spent years making desperate movements in the air, trying to reach across the void. A look of profound, agonizing vulnerability broke across Alexander's face, and he looked completely diminished, like a man who had suddenly realized he was totally blind. I don't understand what he is trying to say," Alexander whispered, the raw confession sounding incredibly painful for a man who was used to knowing everything. Lucy looked at Matthew's gentle signs and translated them for the billionaire. "He says that the fall was an accident, and it doesn't hurt as bad as it looks," Lucy said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "And he is asking you, he is begging you not to punish me for being his friend." Alexander stood absolutely frozen in the dirt, looking back and forth between his son and the young girl, as something deep within his proud soul completely shattered into pieces. He saw his only child injured on the ground, yet using his final ounce of energy to protect the only person in the entire world who actually bothered to listen to him, and Alexander realized the horrifying magnitude of his own failure. He, the magnificent, brilliant Alexander Vance, who managed global networks of communication, was completely locked out of the inner world of his own son. Later that night, After a private orthopedic specialist had arrived at the mansion to confirm that Matthew had suffered a severe ankle sprain rather than a fracture, a heavy tension hung over the estate. Lucy sat quietly in the small kitchen of the staff quarters until her mother, Chloe, walked through the door with a deeply anxious, pale expression on her face. "Lucy, Mr. Vance has explicitly requested your presence in his private executive office immediately," Chloe whispered, her hands shaking as she smoothed down her daughter's hair. "Please remember to be exceptionally polite, apologize profusely for causing any trouble in the garden, and do not say a single word more than what is absolutely necessary." With her legs trembling like water, Lucy walked slowly through the grand corridors of the main house, feeling as though she were a prisoner entering the throne room of a powerful, unpredictable king. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of Alexander's office and stepped into a vast room filled with dark mahogany shelves, thousands of antique books, and a massive floor-to-ceiling window that offered a breathtaking view of the glowing San Francisco Bay Area. Alexander was not seated at his massive desk. Instead, he stood with his back turned to her, staring out into the vast expanse of the illuminated night sky. "Please step inside, Lucy, and close the door behind you," he said in a quiet, low voice that carried absolutely no anger, but rather a profound weight of exhaustion and sorrow. Lucy advanced slowly into the room, her small shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug, while the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock filled the immense space between them. Finally, Alexander turned around to face her, and Lucy was shocked to see that the powerful, invincible billionaire appeared incredibly tired, aged, and deeply sad. "The medical specialist has treated Matthew, wrapped his ankle, and assured me that he will make a full recovery within a few weeks," Alexander began, his voice flat. Then he looked directly into her eyes and asked an unexpected question. "You are his friend, aren't you?" It did not sound like an interrogation. It was a profound, undeniable truth that he had finally been forced to recognize. Lucy looked up at the billionaire and nodded her head slowly. "How long has this been going on?" he asked quietly. "Since the night of the big charity gala, sir," Lucy answered honestly, her voice steady despite her fear. Alexander took a deep, agonizing breath, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair before slumping slowly into a leather chair. "All of this time, he was laughing and smiling right in front of my face, and I never truly saw it," Alexander whispered to himself, looking down at his own polished desk as if he were completely lost. "Today in the garden, when he was terrified and in pain, you understood every single movement of his hands. I am his father, Lucy, and I couldn't understand a single thing." A long, heavy silence enveloped the room once more before he raised his eyes to look at her with a raw, searching vulnerability. "Tell me, why did you take it upon yourself to learn how to speak with him?" Lucy thought about giving a complicated answer, but she decided to speak the absolute truth of her heart. "Because he was completely alone in this massive house, Mr. Vance," Lucy said softly. "My great-grandfather Donald taught me that if you have the ability to stop someone from being alone in the dark, you have a sacred duty to do it." For the very first time since she had arrived at the estate, Alexander Vance truly looked at the housekeeper's young daughter, seeing past her simple clothes and social status. He did not see an insignificant child of the domestic staff. He saw a person possessing an extraordinary degree of moral courage and emotional intelligence that shamed every adult in his social circle. "Your mother has informed me on multiple occasions that you are an exceptionally bright and dedicated student, Lucy," Alexander said after a long moment of contemplation, abruptly shifting the direction of the conversation. Lucy blinked in confusion at the sudden change of topic as he continued. "She told me that you love to read, that you absorb new information with incredible speed, and that your ultimate dream in life is to attend a university and become a school teacher." Lucy nodded her head slowly, completely unable to comprehend where this conversation was heading, as Alexander adopted the focused, pragmatic demeanor of a corporate executive implementing a strategic solution. "I want to make a formal business proposition to you, Lucy," Alexander stated firmly, leaning forward in his chair while keeping his eyes locked onto hers. "I want you to officially continue being Matthew's companion and friend, but I no longer want you hiding in the corridors or sneaking out into the gardens like a thief. I want you to officially become an open, permanent part of his daily life and education within this estate." Lucy furrowed her brow, her innocent mind struggling to grasp the underlying meaning of his words as Alexander continued to lay out the terms of his offer. I am prepared to financially compensate you handsomely for your time, and furthermore, I will establish a fully funded educational trust in your name. A complete, unrestricted scholarship that will cover every single expense of your university education at any institution you choose when the time comes. Lucy's eyes widened to an extraordinary degree, her breath catching in her throat as she realized that such an incredible financial opportunity was something her mother could never have dreamed of providing in a lifetime. All you have to do in exchange for this security is continue being his friend, Alexander said before pausing, his voice dropping to a low, deeply emotional register as he spoke the words that truly mattered to his soul. And I want you to teach me. Lucy lifted her head sharply, utterly stunned. I want you to teach me sign language, Lucy. I desperately want to learn how to speak with my own son. Lucy stood entirely speechless in the center of the magnificent office, her mind reeling from the surreal reality that one of the most powerful technology titans in the world was begging an 11-year-old girl for help. Yet, as she looked at his desperate face, her young mind understood exactly what Alexander was trying to do. He was approaching his broken relationship with his son the only way he knew how, as a business transaction. He was attempting to use his immense wealth to buy a financial bridge back into Matthew's life, and he was asking her to act as the architect and builder of that bridge. For a brief second, she thought about her mother's endless financial worries, the incredible security of a university scholarship, and the future she had always wanted. But then she thought of Matthew, the beautiful, lonely boy who didn't care about trusts or corporations, the boy who simply needed someone to sit with him in the quiet and value his soul. She looked directly into Alexander's eyes, looking past the billionaire facade to see a deeply frightened father trapped inside a silent cage of his own design. I will gladly do what you ask, Mr. Vance, Lucy responded firmly, her voice echoing with absolute clarity. Alexander's face flooded with an immense wave of relief, and he began to thank her. But Lucy raised her hand slightly to continue speaking. But as for the money and the university scholarship, you must give all of that directly to my mother to thank her for her hard work in this house. She took a deep breath. I refuse to accept a single penny for being Matthew's friend. I am his friend simply because I love him, and I will teach you sign language completely for free, because that is exactly what friends do for one another. Alexander Vance, a man who had lived his entire life under the strict assumption that absolutely everything and everyone in this world carried a price tag, was left completely speechless. This young girl was offering him something that all of his billions could never purchase: pure, unadulterated human loyalty and love. A soft, incredibly humbled smile finally broke across his face, and he nodded his head slowly. Very well, Lucy, he said gently. We will do this entirely your way. The sudden, unprecedented news of the formal agreement sent an immediate shockwave of surprise, and whispered gossip through every corner of the massive Atherton mansion. Lucy Hayes, the young daughter of the executive housekeeper, was now officially authorized to spend her afternoons in the main house as the personal companion of young Matthew Vance. Inside the massive industrial kitchens and laundry rooms, the domestic staff whispered among themselves, some expressing deep shock, while others struggled to understand why a billionaire would elevate a servant's child to such a position. Lucy, however, paid absolutely no attention to the gossip. Her entire world had effectively narrowed down to two people: a boy who communicated through the air with his hands and a powerful father who was desperate to learn. Her mother, Chloe, wept tears of pure joy and overwhelming relief one evening in their small apartment, gripping the official financial trust documents that guaranteed their long-term security. A complete, unrestricted university scholarship, Lucy, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with emotion as she held her daughter tightly. Do you truly understand the magnitude of what you have done? You will be able to become anything you want in this world. But please, my sweet girl, promise me you will remain incredibly careful. Never forget who they are, and never forget who we are in this house. Lucy understood her mother's deep-seated caution, but she no longer viewed the world through the cold lens of social hierarchy. To her, there were simply human souls, and some of them desperately needed to be heard. The very first official instructional lesson between Lucy and Alexander Vance was an incredibly tense, profoundly awkward, and highly uncomfortable affair for everyone involved. They gathered together in the cavernous private library, where Matthew sat comfortably in a large leather armchair with his injured foot elevated on a soft plush ottoman as he recovered from his sprain. The young boy had a wonderfully mischievous, highly amused smile plastered across his face. For the first time in his life, he was the powerful observer, and his formidable father was the vulnerable student. "We will begin our lesson with the basic physical forms of the manual alphabet," Lucy said, trying her absolute best to sound like a confident, professional teacher as she stood before the billionaire. Alexander Vance, a man who regularly commanded boardrooms filled with hundreds of brilliant minds, stared down at his own large hands as if they were clumsy, alien tools that he had never operated before. Lucy raised her hands and demonstrated the precise movement for the very first letter of the alphabet, and Alexander immediately attempted to copy her gesture, but his long fingers were incredibly rigid, stiff, and tense. "No, sir, it is not quite like that," Lucy said with a gentle, encouraging tone, stepping forward to carefully manipulate his large fingers with her own small hands. "You must place your thumb precisely right here against the side of your palm, relaxing the rest of your fingers so the shape is clear." Alexander took a deep breath, focused his immense intellect entirely on his hand, and tried the movement again and again, his face sweating from the intense concentration. Matthew watched the entire display from his armchair with absolute delight, before suddenly raising his hands to rapidly sign a message directly to Lucy. "My father is an incredibly slow and clumsy student," Matthew signed, his eyes dancing with a hilarious, silent laughter that Lucy had to fight desperately to suppress. She quickly raised her own hands and signed back to him, telling him to be nice to his father, creating a silent dialogue right in front of Alexander, who could only watch them with a look of humble bewilderment. From that pivotal afternoon onward, these intensive training sessions became an unshakable, permanent part of the mansion's weekly routine, occurring 3 times a week without fail. Alexander approached the language with the same disciplined intensity that had built his technology empire, practicing his movements for hours on end, but he quickly discovered that sign language was entirely different from anything he had ever mastered. It was not a mechanical system of cold data that could be memorized through intellect alone. It required a person to feel deeply, to look directly into another human's eyes, and to express raw vulnerability, things he had spent years avoiding.